everyone agreed that you need wealth to achieve the promises of communism and nationalism. If you're going to bring prosperity to people, you need wealth. If you're going to build a strong government, you need wealth. If you're going to have a strong army that can defend your government, you need wealth. You need steel, you need tanks, you need buildings, you need cars, you need roads, you need food. You have to produce, you have to make stuff. And Mao is concerned that that growth is not fast enough. In particular, Mao, being a nationalist especially, wants to make China equal with the Western nations and with the Soviet Union as quickly as possible, right? Mao wanted, in a sense, to prove that China was as good as any other country and that he was a good, in a sense, genius of a revolutionary leader. And he could prove that by making China great, making China powerful. So Mao is concerned that growth is not fast enough. You need wealth if you're going to have national independence, national strength, and people's prosperity. And there's also a competitive aspect to this. It's not just China on its own. He wants to make China equal with the Western nations and the Soviet Union as quickly as possible. Now, Mao looks at this strategy of gradual, technologically based development and says, you know what, this isn't working fast enough. Right? The 5-year plan does work in a sense, in that it does bring real economic development, but it's not fast enough. And Mao says, look, what allowed us to conquer the nationalists? It wasn't technology. They had the advanced technology. It wasn't money. They had the money. But what happened was we were so inspired by our cause, by our revolutionary fervor, that we were able to defeat the nationalists, right? Remember, the nationalists got tanks from the United States, but their soldiers didn't believe in their cause, so they ran away and abandoned those tanks, and suddenly those became communist tanks. So revolutionary fervor had allowed the communists to conquer the nationalists. So logically speaking, revolutionary fervor should allow for rapid economic growth. The peasants conquered the nationalists. They can also conquer our economic problems. Right? That's Mao's basic idea, and that's going to be the idea leading, or I should say behind, the Great Leap Forward, which is an attempt to use revolutionary fervor to develop the country's economy quickly. And at its basis is the idea that you can overcome material problems with spirit. It's kind of fascinating because this is a lot like the Japanese perspective of how they could win World War II, they thought, spirit over the material. Mao Zedong's going to try that here. We're going to see that it has pretty much the same results. So to give you a sense of this ideology, I want to share with you a slogan that Mao came up with. Man's ability to know and change nature is unlimited. Right? Man's ability to know and change nature is unlimited. I mean, think about that for a second. Right? We can do anything we want to. Right? We can do anything we want to. We can transform nature any way we want. And there's this interesting song that is associated with the Great Leap Forward. In heaven there is no Jade Emperor. On earth there is no Dragon King. And these are traditional gods in the Chinese pantheon. I am the Jade Emperor. I am the Dragon King. I order the 3 mountains and 5 peaks. Make way, here I come. And so this song is celebrating this idea that humanity is kind of like a god. Right? And we can do whatever we want. And I can tell the mountains to get out of the way, and they will get out of my way. And this basic ideology is what's going to govern the Great Leap Forward. As you can guess, this is going to be problematic because the fact is, I cannot order mountains to get out of the way. As anyone who knows me knows, I am not a god, right? Human beings are not gods. We can't do whatever we want. And our ability to change nature is not unlimited. But these very unrealistic, impractical ideas are what's going to drive this Great Leap Forward. So how then is this going to work? How do we actually apply on the ground this idea of spirit over material? Well, remember, we're focusing on this idea of revolutionary fervor. The revolutionary fervor of the peasants, the revolutionary fervor of the masses. That is how we communists, and this is Mao Zedong's thinking, that's how we communists defeated the nationalists in the Civil War. They had the technology, but we had the fervor, and we won. So we can do that, again, to conquer our economic problems. And in particular, how we're going to do that is, in a sense, we can use people to replace capital. So in areas where there's not as many people or wages are high, you often introduce labor-saving devices. You bring in a machine that one person can operate that allows that person to do the work of 10 people, right? Or 100 people, or however many people. Those machines, though, are expensive, and China cannot afford them. However, China has 10 people or 100 people to do the work that that machine could do, right? So the logic here is we Chinese don't need labor-saving devices. We can rely on the amazing power, in a sense, the unlimited power of the revolutionary masses to bring change, right? So we can use people to replace capital. We don't need fancy schmancy machines. People, fired with revolutionary fervor, can do anything. Our ability to know and change nature is unlimited. So on the ground, you can see what this looks like on the left. That is a picture of peasants trying to make steel in these what are called backyard furnaces, right? So they have an area of land where they build furnaces with the purpose of making steel. That's the idea. And you may recall earlier when we were talking about the 5-year plan, how steel industry was kind of the center of industry, right? You can't make cars, you can't make tractors, you can't make advanced buildings without having adequate steel. And the idea is, how are we going to get adequate steel? Not by importing technology from the Soviet Union, not by all these fancy machines, but by relying on people to make steel themselves, because fired by revolutionary fervor, they can do anything. On the right side, you can see an image of a propaganda poster that is promising that this onrush, this torrent of steel, can be used to swamp our enemies. So on top, you see the dragon spewing forth all this ocean of molten steel being produced by the backyard furnaces on the dragon's back. And you can see there's a couple of people it's going to cover. That represents the United States and Great Britain, right? We're going to overpass them in steel production, not by relying on technology, but by relying on the revolutionary fervor of the people. Now, there are going to be some problems with this in terms of application, in terms of results that we're going to see. But I want to point out one key one before I turn to this whole thing about making steel. There was a tendency to differentiate animals between good animals and bad animals, between useful animals and pests. And that differentiation is not altogether wrong. And you can see it in these posters. On the left, this is a poster from the Great Leap Forward promising to produce more cotton, more grain. But on the lower right, you can see this idea that there's going to be an increase in pigs and in ducks, which are common food animals, and also, of course, can produce fertilizer. So those are considered good animals. You want to raise them, you want to produce them for human benefit. They're good for us. On the right, you can see an image where you have a rat, a sparrow, a fly, and a mosquito. And it says, and they're stabbed through with this knife, and it says to eliminate the 4 pests is basically what the message is up there. And so they classified those animals bad animals, and they actually had campaigns, competitions even, to kill as many of these as possible. Right, so kill as many mosquitoes as possible. Sometimes there was like a fly quota, like you had to capture and kill a certain number of flies a day. It was interesting. I remember Professor George Wilson knew a Chinese professor who had grown up during this time period, and he could catch flies out of the air with his hand. Like, it was amazing. The guy would be talking, and he could just grab a fly with his hand because he grew up in this time period and you were expected to catch flies. Now, in a sense, that kind of makes sense, right? And that's the idea here. We're going to have a group of people. We had this problem. We had these pests like mosquitoes that spread disease. Rats spread disease and they eat grain. Flies spread disease. Let's mobilize the people to get rid of these animals, these pests that are bad. And that makes a lot of sense. But here's the problem. A biologist would tell you, or a historian if he's read what biologists have written, would tell you that you have to be careful when you go around killing animals. This can be very bad for the ecology. Getting rid of flies and rats is not such a problem. Neither is getting rid of mosquitoes. But getting rid of sparrows is a terrible idea because sparrows eat insects that eat grain. So there will be this mass slaughter of sparrows, and the people are very happy about this because they successfully kill huge numbers of sparrows, thinking that will allow for there to be more grain because they're like, yeah, we killed these sparrows that killed grain. The problem is sparrows ate bugs and other pests that also eat grain. And sparrows actually are able to save on grain production, even though they themselves eat grain, because the bugs they kill eat more grain than the sparrows. So in other words, killing sparrows is a terrible idea because it actually leads to an increase in insects that also destroy grain production. Any scientists, any biologists could have told the government this, but you were not allowed to question this. You were not allowed to challenge this. Questioning or challenging such campaigns was challenging the party, was challenging the head of the party, Mao Zedong, and was challenging then what was going to make China great. So here was the problem. This is a fundamental problem. You were not allowed to criticize because any kind of criticism was not understood, even if it was based on something so clear as, scientific proof that sparrows actually lead to a net increase in grain. It didn't matter. To question the party was to question Mao, the leader, and Mao and the party were what were needed for a new China. So if you question things, you were a traitor to the nation. You were probably an enemy of the communist revolution. You were probably secretly like a bourgeoisie or capitalist or rightist or something like that. So anyone challenging this could easily find themselves criticized. And what's really astounding to me was if you were to say, hey, we should not kill all these sparrows, you could be labeled as superstitious, right? Because you didn't trust the party. So there's a problem. We see some unrealistic things going on, and no one is allowed to speak out about them. So here's the thing. The Great Leap Forward lasts from 1958 to 1962. It was meant to harness the revolutionary fervor of the people in order to bring massive, rapid economic development. It failed miserably. The economy shrank. Far from the economy expanding, the economy shrank. And more than 40 million people died from famine in particular, right? More than 40 million people died from famine in particular, right? There were other things. People were also executed and shot and so forth. But the big killer that, like I said, killed more than 40 million people was famine. Please note, remember, the number of Chinese estimated to have died in World War II was between 10 and 20 million people. But here, in this essentially human-made disaster, more than 40 million people will die. Why? Well, there was a lot of wasted labor. There's two problems with there's multiple problems. I'm going to talk about a couple in particular. There's problems with this whole backyard steel thing. Peasants who are making steel are not growing crops. Peasants who are making steel are not growing crops. So food production went down because people were busy doing things like making steel. Now, as an aside, the steel was completely useless. Steel made in backyard furnaces is not very strong. You can't get the fire hot enough. You cannot make good steel without good technology, without proper equipment, without proper training. And these peasants had none of that stuff. Right. So there was this kind of wasted labor. So that's a problem, right? People invested in all this time and effort in making steel that was useless instead of farming. Now, if they would have made good steel, at least they could have maybe sold it and bought food, but they can't do that. They end up without much food because they were making steel instead of making food, and the steel they made was worthless. In addition, in order to expand productivity, agriculturally speaking, poor techniques were utilized. And here's the thing, farmers know how to farm generally. If you're going to try and convince a farmer to change how they farm, you better have, really good evidence for why they should change it. And in particular, if you're a biologist or a specialist in agriculture, maybe you could tell farmers something useful. But if you're a politician, you probably should not tell farmers how to farm. I'm certainly not going to tell farmers how to farm because I know nothing about farming. But what I do know was that some people would say, particularly these were the communist officials, would say, you know what? It's good to plow deeply, right? When you plow the earth, you want to plow deeply because that gets the nutrients that are down below up so the plants can benefit from them. Okay, that makes sense. Farmers have known that for, thousands of years. So why not then this politician, this official, communist official, would go and say, why not just go even deeper? If 3 inches of plowing is good, then 6 inches must be better, and a foot must be even better. It's not. It's terrible. It will kill the plant. But you couldn't resist. You had to do this. This is what the Communist Party told you to do. To question it is treason, can get you killed. Likewise, they would say, well, you know what? This much fertilizer is good, so why not just give twice as much fertilizer? That's a good idea, right? If we give twice as much fertilizer, won't the crops double in productivity? That's logical. But that's not what happens. If you give too much fertilizer, it will kill the crops. So you had politicians, government officials telling farmers how to farm, and the problem was these officials didn't know what they were talking about. The other problem was that there was promises that they could grow a lot of grain. There was always promises like, yeah, we can grow this much grain. If we don't promise to grow a lot of grain, if we say it's unrealistic to grow this much grain, we'll be in trouble. So yeah, we can grow a lot of grain. And so what would happen is that the government would say, okay, great, you can grow this much grain. This is what we're setting your quota at. So what ended up happening was the government set grain quotas unrealistically. They would say to these farmers, okay, you guys got to grow 1,000 pounds of grain. And they would only grow like, say, 1,200. And then the government would take 1,000. And there wouldn't be enough left over to feed the people. So the government extracted grain based on unrealistic expectations of what farmers could actually grow. Now, a lot of times the government actually knew the farmers didn't grow that much. They didn't care. They wanted the grain. There were also other problems, right? There was too much emphasis on grain to begin with. Grain is not the only thing people need to eat. You can do things like grow apples, and you can eat apples. You could grow potatoes. You could grow lots of different kinds of food that will sustain human life. But the government wanted grain, and everything had to be measured in grain. So what ended up happening was you would have like an apple orchard that was growing apples, and people would cut down the orchard, use the wood to try and power those furnaces, and then try and grow rice or wheat where the apple orchard had once stood. And the problem was the reason they planted apples there in the first place was because they grew better there than rice or wheat. So instead of having apples, which could have fed the people and kept them alive, they tried to grow wheat and grain and rice in areas that didn't grow well in. And like I said, they cut down the apple trees to use to feed furnaces. So too much emphasis on grain led to people trying to grow grain where it really wasn't effective to grow. The whole time, the government was paying foreign debts with grain even when it knew that people were starving. So the government, even when it knew people were starving, would extract grain from the peasants, who the revolution, remember, was supposed to be for, and use it to pay off foreign debt to get the technology that they needed. And they still imported technology, especially military technology, during this time period. They just expected the peasants to be able to figure out how to magically grow grain. So, and they would not admit that there was any problem. The communists refused to admit that there was any problem, and they refused to accept aid. Right? They refused to accept food aid that could have been used to feed the peasants, because that would admit that this was all a terrible idea. And the other thing that's really disturbing about this, remember, you don't own your own land anymore, right? You don't own your own land anymore. You work as a peasant on the collective. You don't own that land. You work as a peasant on the collective. And so if you had a family farm, you grow food, you sell your surplus, you keep the rest. If my parents live with me and they're old and they can't work much, it's not a huge deal. I just don't sell as much food. I don't get as much money, but at least I have some food to feed them. That's on my family farm. I can take care of my parents. But that's not how the system works now. They have a work point system. So I'm a peasant. I work on the collective. I get points based on how much work I do, and that determines how much food I get. So that works as long as you're healthy. But there's two problems. If you're unhealthy, you're not going to get enough food to eat, and of course that means that eventually you'll die. But the other problem is the government now is in charge of the food. It's going to give this only to people that seem useful. So in the past, when I had my own family farm, if my parents get old or sick or my kid can't work, at least I can feed them. I can keep them alive. But not under this system. So one reason there's so many people that die is that there's people, as starvation starts to take hold, they can't work. They're not given, they don't get work points. They're not able then to get food. And this is, again, the problem, right? And this is one reason. Remember, I'm not a big fan of communism. This is one reason why, because if you look at the story of history of communism, this kind of repeats itself, especially in these revolutionary periods. The revolution was supposed to help the peasants. The peasants supported the communists because they promised them land. But they took the land away from them, and now they're taking the food away from them. And remember, if you question this, if you challenge this, you could be punished. You could be denied food. You could be put in jail. You could be executed. So it's just a major disaster where the government follows terrible policies that kill lots of people, and anyone who challenges them can be punished.